At my daughter's wedding, I expected tears of joy. Instead, her fiancé's words cut deeper than any knife. He introduced me to his boss as an unemployed loser, but if he thought humiliation would break me, he had no idea who he was dealing with. My name is Richard Walker, and I'm 52 years old. For most of my life, I wore calloused hands as a badge of honor. I built homes, repaired roofs, poured foundations, and carved out a reputation as a man who worked hard and provided for his family. I was never rich, but I was proud of my daughter, Emily, who grew into a bright, kind young woman with a heart full of dreams. When she told me she was getting married, my heart swelled. I had lost her mother 5 years earlier, and Emily had been my anchor in those dark days. The thought of walking her down the aisle, of seeing her start her new chapter, felt like a second chance at happiness. I spent months saving what I could, even taking on small handyman jobs around town to scrape together enough money for her wedding fund. "Dad, you don't have to," Emily told me one night, her hand on mine. But I wanted to. It was my way of showing her that, even without her mother here, she was loved and supported. The wedding day arrived, warm and golden. The church was filled with flowers, and guests murmured happily as they found their seats. Emily looked radiant in her dress, her smile bright enough to outshine the sun. My chest tightened with pride as I walked her down the aisle, my hand steady despite the tears burning in my eyes. Her fiancé, Jason, was everything Emily seemed to want. Charming, successful, always flashing the kind of smile that wins over a room. I'll admit, I never fully trusted him. Something in his eyes always felt calculating, like every word he spoke had a hidden angle. But for Emily's sake, I kept quiet. After the ceremony, at the reception hall, Jason led me across the room toward a group of men in sleek suits. He draped an arm over my shoulder, his cologne sharp, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Gentlemen," he said with a grin, "this is my father-in-law, Richard. Well, let's just say he's between jobs these days. An unemployed loser, really. But hey, we love him anyway." The laughter that followed sliced through me. My ears burned, my throat tightened. The room spun for a second as his words sank in. Unemployed loser. He didn't just embarrass me. He reduced my entire life, my decades of hard work, my sacrifices for Emily, into a cruel punchline for his boss and colleagues. I forced a stiff smile, shaking the men's hands with trembling fingers. Inside, I was crumbling. My daughter's new husband, the man I had welcomed into our family, had humiliated me in front of strangers on what should have been one of the proudest days of my life. I excused myself, walking out to the balcony where the cool evening air hit my face. My chest ached, not from the words alone, but from the betrayal behind them. Jason hadn't just mocked me. He had shown me how little he respected me. Emily found me there a few minutes later, concern etched on her face. "Dad, are you okay? You left so suddenly." I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just needed some air." She smiled gently, oblivious to what had just happened. She didn't hear Jason's words, and I couldn't bring myself to ruin her night with the truth. I hugged her tight, telling her how beautiful she looked, while inside, something shifted. Humiliation has a way of planting seeds. That night, on that balcony, as music and laughter spilled from the hall behind me, I made a silent vow. Jason might think of me as an unemployed loser, but he had no idea of the man he had just provoked. The morning after the wedding, I should have been replaying the joy of walking Emily down the aisle. Instead, Jason's words echoed in my head like a curse. Unemployed loser. The smirk on his face, the laughter of his colleagues, it gnawed at me with every breath. I told myself to let it go, for Emily's sake. She was happy, and that mattered more than my pride. But life has a way of testing you when you least expect it. Jason and Emily invited me to brunch at their new home the following Sunday. I brought a bottle of wine, a modest gift, though I couldn't help noticing the way Jason raised an eyebrow at it, like it wasn't up to his standards. Their house was big, modern, spotless, far beyond anything I could have afforded. Jason strutted around it like a king showing off his castle. During brunch, Jason's arrogance bled through every word. Emily's father worked construction, he said casually to one of Emily's bridesmaids, who had joined us. Manual labor, it's honest work, I guess, but not much of a future in it. That's why I promised Emily she'd never have to struggle. I gripped my coffee cup tighter, forcing myself not to respond. Emily laughed it off, thinking Jason was joking, but I saw the glint in his eyes. He wasn't joking. He was establishing his dominance, marking his territory, not just over Emily, but over me. Later that week, Emily called, her voice hesitant. Dad, Jason says you should take a break from visiting so often. He doesn't want us to feel crowded. Crowded. I'd only been over twice. My throat tightened, but I didn't want her to feel caught in the middle. Of course, sweetheart. You focus on your new life. I'll give you space. When I hung up, the silence of my small apartment felt heavier than ever. I looked around the cracked walls, the worn furniture, the remnants of a life built through sweat and sacrifice. Jason might have seen an unemployed loser, but these walls had held laughter, tears, birthdays, and Christmas mornings. They held proof of everything I had fought for. A few days later, I ran into Jason downtown. He was with two of his co-workers, laughing loud enough for the whole block to hear. He spotted me and waved me over like a man calling a stray dog. Hey, Rich, he said, never Richard, always Rich, like it stripped me down a level. You still, between jobs? If you need something, I could probably get you work as a groundskeeper at my firm. Might be more your speed than construction, since, well, that didn't exactly pan out, did it? His buddies chuckled. My jaw tightened, but I forced a thin smile. I'll keep it in mind. Then I walked away before my anger betrayed me. That night, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The man staring back wasn't weak. He wasn't finished. Jason didn't know me. Didn't know the years I had spent building, the contracts I had managed, the people who still owed me favors. He only saw what he wanted to see, a man past his prime, easy to belittle. But each insult, each smirk, each dismissal was fuel. The breaking point came when Emily invited me to a dinner party Jason was hosting for his boss and clients. She wanted me there, proud as ever of her father. I arrived in my best suit, shoes polished, nerves steady. Jason, however, had other plans. He introduced me to his boss again, this time with a smirk. This is Richard, my father-in-law. He used to work construction, but he's retired now. Doesn't really do much these days. Enjoys his free time, The word stung worse than before. He hadn't just called me a loser this time. He painted me as irrelevant, useless, a man collecting dust while the world moved on. His boss gave a polite smile, but I caught the flicker of disinterest in his eyes. I sipped my drink, keeping my expression neutral, but inside, a storm raged. Jason was using me as a prop to elevate himself, to show off how he had risen above. But what Jason didn't realize was this. While he was busy laughing at me, I was listening, observing, and I was beginning to piece together exactly how to strike back. I drove home from Jason and Emily's dinner party with my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than ever before. The streets blurred past, but my mind was locked on one thing. Jason's smug face, as he called me retired, doesn't really do much these days. Retired, as if I had chosen to step aside, as if my worth had expired like milk past its date. The truth was, after the recession and my wife's passing, I had scaled back my construction business. The tornado that hit town last year had finished off what little equipment I had left. But none of that erased the decades I spent building homes, businesses, and relationships. I wasn't irrelevant. I wasn't useless. Jason had no idea who he was dealing with. I pulled into my driveway, shut off the engine, and sat in silence. For years, I'd carried the weight of loss, of exhaustion. I told myself my role was just to survive, to be there for Emily. But Jason had lit a fuse I didn't even know was still there. In the quiet of my living room, surrounded by photographs of Emily growing up and my late wife smiling at birthdays, I finally admitted it. I wasn't just hurt. I was angry. And anger, when tempered with focus, could be the sharpest weapon a man could wield. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, my mind racing. Jason wasn't just arrogant. He was calculated. Every time he mocked me, he did it in front of people he wanted to impress. His boss, his colleagues, his friends. It wasn't random. It was strategy. He wanted to elevate himself by tearing me down. That meant one thing. Jason was insecure. And insecure men always had cracks in their armor. I began to think back on what I knew about him. Jason worked in finance, always bragging about deals, clients, numbers. At the dinner party, I noticed how hard he tried to keep his boss's attention, how desperate he was to appear indispensable. A man like that built his whole image on appearances, and appearances could crumble. I sat back, the outline of a plan forming in my mind. I didn't need to fight Jason with fists or shouting matches. That would only make me look like the bitter old man he wanted me to be. No, if he wanted to humiliate me publicly, I would return the favor. Only my strike would be sharper, cleaner, impossible to ignore. But first, I needed to remind myself of who I was. The next morning, I pulled out an old leather briefcase from the closet. Inside were contracts, photographs, and awards for my years running Walker Construction. Projects I'd overseen, buildings that still stood tall across the city, homes that families still lived in. Proof that I had been more than just a laborer. I had been a builder of legacies. As I flipped through the documents, my anger turned into resolve. Jason saw me as obsolete because he didn't know my story. But when the time was right, I'd make sure he and everyone around him saw exactly who I was. Later that week, I called an old friend, Mark Thompson, who now owned one of the largest contracting firms in the state. Mark answered with the same booming laugh I remembered. "Richard, haven't heard from you in years. How the hell are you?" We talked for over an hour. I told him about the tornado, about Emily's wedding, about Jason's arrogance. Mark whistled low. "Sounds like your son-in-law doesn't know who he's dealing with. You're the reason I got started in this business, Richard. Don't you forget that." By the time I hung up, I felt 10 years younger. Mark invited me to join him on a few consulting projects. Nothing full-time, but enough to get my name back out there. Enough to remind myself and others that I wasn't finished. As I hung up the phone, I smiled for the first time in weeks. Jason thought he had buried me under humiliation. But what he didn't realize was that he had only awakened the part of me that thrived under pressure. This wasn't just about pride anymore. It was about justice. About showing my daughter that her father wasn't the weak man Jason wanted him to be. That night, I wrote a single line in my notebook, underlined twice. He called me an unemployed loser. I'll show him the kind of man who never quits. The following week, I woke earlier than usual, the morning light spilling across my desk. My notebook sat open, the words from the night before still etched in black ink. He called me an unemployed loser. I'll show him the kind of man who never quits. It wasn't just a line anymore. It was my mission. Jason thrived on image, his crisp suits, his luxury car, the house that screamed success. Every insult he threw my way was about making me look smaller, so he could appear larger. If I wanted to cut him down, I had to strike where his ego lived, in the world he was desperate to impress. Step one was simple: rebuild my presence. Mark had given me an opening, and I grabbed it with both hands. Within days, I was sitting in on a project bid with his company, offering insights only years of hands-on experience could provide. When the client shook my hand afterward and told me they'd love to work with us, I felt a surge of pride I hadn't felt in years. Step two was positioning. Jason's firm and Mark's company often operated in overlapping circles. Finance on one side, construction on the other, deals, investments, and contracts connected them more than Jason realized. If I played my cards right, our paths would cross where it mattered most, in front of the people Jason was desperate to impress. I kept my involvement quiet. Emily knew I was consulting again, and she was thrilled for me, but I asked her not to mention to Jason. Let it be a surprise, I told her with a smile. She thought I meant a pleasant one. In time, she'd understand. Meanwhile, I kept watching Jason. He didn't make it hard. Every post on social media was a brag. Dinners with his boss, photos of his new watch, captions about hustle and grind. He was painting a picture of success, so bright it blinded him to the cracks forming underneath. Rebecca, one of Emily's bridesmaids, called me one afternoon. She worked at the same firm as Jason and had seen me at brunch. "Mr. Walker, I don't know how much you know about Jason's work, but he's not as secure as he pretends. He's been over-promising on deals, trying to impress the boss. People are starting to notice." Her words were gasoline on the fire already burning in me. Jason wasn't invincible. He was reckless. Step 3, gather leverage. I started asking quiet questions. Old contacts in town still respected me, and many of them had run-ins with Jason's firm. Over coffee, I learned Jason had been pushing aggressive investment strategies, ones that looked shiny on the surface but carried dangerous risks underneath. He hadn't burned anyone yet, but it was only a matter of time. The pieces were coming together. All I had to do was wait for the right moment to reveal myself. Not as the washed-up father-in-law Jason mocked, but as a man who could expose him in front of the very people whose approval he craved. One evening, Emily invited me over for dinner. Jason was there, of course, playing the role of charming husband. But I noticed a flicker in his eyes when I mentioned casually that I'd been keeping busy. "Busy?" Jason asked, his smile tight. "Doing what? Crossword puzzles?" I held his gaze, steady and calm. "Consulting. A few big projects with Thompson and Company." The name landed like a stone in a pond. Jason's fork froze halfway to his mouth. He knew the name. Everyone in his world knew the name. "Mark Thompson?" he asked carefully. "The very same," I said, sipping my water. "We go back years." He asked me to lend a hand. Jason forced a laugh, but the color had drained slightly from his face. Emily, oblivious to the tension, beamed. "That's wonderful, Dad." I kept my expression neutral, but inside, I savored the moment. The first crack had appeared in Jason's armor. He had worked so hard to paint me as irrelevant, and now he realized I was standing closer to his world than he ever imagined. That night, as I drove home, I knew I was on the right path. My plan wasn't about yelling or fistfights. It was about patience, precision, and letting Jason's own arrogance do most of the work. The weeks that followed felt like stepping into a different life. For years, I had been drifting, half alive, weighed down by loss. Now, every morning I woke up with purpose. Jason thought he'd humiliated me into silence, but he had no idea I was building momentum beneath his feet. Mark wasted no time putting me to work. I joined him at site visits, reviewed contracts, and even pitched ideas to clients. Word spread quickly. Richard Walker is back in the game. Old colleagues who hadn't heard my name in years were calling, asking if I was available to consult. One afternoon, as I left a meeting downtown, I spotted Jason across the street. He was stepping out of his sleek black car, phone glued to his ear, suit pressed to perfection. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw it. Confusion, maybe even unease. He didn't wave. He just watched me walk into a building with Mark's logo on the door. That was the beginning. The following week, Mark invited me to a networking gala. It was a kind of event Jason lived for. Wine glasses clinking, soft jazz in the background, men and women in tailored suits circling the room like sharks. As we walked in, I could feel eyes on me. Some remember me from my old construction days. Others whispered about my return. Halfway through the evening, I heard a familiar voice. Jason. He was holding court near the bar, his laugh loud, his gestures bigger than the story he was telling. When he spotted me at Mark's side, his smile faltered for just a second. "Richard," he said smoothly, striding over. "Didn't expect to see you here. This isn't exactly your scene." I smiled politely. "On the contrary, Jason, I've been consulting with Mark's firm." Seams were moving in the same circles now. The words hung in the air like smoke. Jason's colleagues exchanged glances. He forced a laugh, but his jaw tightened. "Well, good for you. Staying busy is important at your age." At my age, always a jab, always a little cut. But this time it didn't land. Not in front of the men and women who had just watched me close a deal minutes earlier. Later that night, I stood near the balcony with Mark, watching Jason from across the room. "He doesn't like you being here," Mark muttered. "Good," I replied. "He needs to get used to it." Step by step, the balance of power was shifting. Jason had built his world on perception, on being the most polished, the most successful, and now I was dismantling that image, not by attacking him directly, but by standing where he thought I couldn't. The real test came 2 weeks later. Mark asked me to join him for a high-profile presentation, a pitch for a multi-million-dollar development project. The room was filled with investors, bankers, and city officials. As I laid out the plans, highlighting risks and strategies, I caught sight of Jason sitting near the back. His firm was involved, too, but he hadn't known I'd be speaking. When I finished, the room erupted in questions, handshakes, and compliments. Jason sat frozen, his smile strained. For once, he wasn't a star. Afterward, one of the investors clapped me on the back. "Richard, I had no idea you were still in the business. Impressive work." I caught Jason's eyes across the room. His boss stood beside him, nodding approvingly at me. That was the moment I knew the tables had turned. Jason wanted to introduce me as an unemployed loser. Instead, his own boss now saw me as an asset, a man with experience and credibility. When the meeting ended, Jason cornered me near the exit. His voice was low, tight with frustration. "What exactly are you trying to do, Richard? You think you can just waltz back in and—" "I'm not trying." I cut him off, my tone calm but firm. "I'm doing. And the best part? I don't need to humiliate you to do it. You're doing that to yourself." His face reddened, but he said nothing. For the first time, Jason didn't have a comeback. I walked away, my step steady, my chest lighter. The man who had once laughed at me in front of his boss had just watched me win the respect of his entire world. And that was only the beginning. The weeks rolled on, and the more I rebuilt my reputation, the more Jason's arrogance slipped into desperation. Word had spread. Richard Walker was not only back, but he was winning respect from people Jason had spent years trying to impress. I could feel his eyes on me at every event, every meeting. Once, he thrived in these rooms. Now, he looked over his shoulder every time I entered, as if my presence alone cast a shadow across his spotlight. The breaking point came at a charity dinner. The ballroom buzzed with chatter, the chandeliers glowing golden light across tables of polished silverware. Mark had asked me to join him, and together we worked the room with quiet confidence. But I knew Jason was there the moment I felt the tension in the air. He was at a table near the front, laughing too loudly, his glass refilled too often. Emily sat beside him, smiling politely, though I could see the strain in her eyes. Midway through the evening, Jason stood to give a toast. His words stumbled slightly, the alcohol loosening his tongue. "To success," he declared, raising his glass. "And to those who know how to earn it, not cling to the past like some washed-up." His eyes flicked toward me. The room went quiet. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. "Jason," I said evenly, my voice carrying across the hall, "you've had plenty to say about me these past months. Maybe it's time I say something back." Murmurs rippled through the room. Jason smirked, clearly expecting me to bluster or stumble. Instead, I stepped forward, calm and steady. "You've called me an unemployed loser. You've painted me as irrelevant. But what you've never bothered to understand is this. While you measure success in suits and cars, I measure mine in foundations, homes that families still live in, buildings that still stand tall after decades. That's my legacy." I saw heads nodding around the room. Jason's smirk faltered. "You wanted to humiliate me in front of your world." I continued, "But look around you, Jason. This isn't your world. It's ours. Built by people who know what it means to sweat, to sacrifice, to earn. And all you've done is prove that behind your polished smile is a man so insecure he has to tear others down just to feel tall." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Jason's face flushed red, his jaw clenched tight. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat, his voice louder than he intended. "You're just a washed-up handyman riding on your past." But the damage was done. His outburst wasn't confidence. It was panic. His boss, seated at the same table, leaned back his chair, eyes narrowed in thought. Colleagues exchanged glances. Emily's face paled, horror dawning as she realized the truth of what I was saying. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to insult him. I simply looked him in the eye and said, "The difference between you and me, Jason, is simple. I've already proven who I am. You're still trying." I left the words hanging there, then turned and walked back to my seat. The applause didn't come immediately. It started small, a few claps, then grew until the entire room was on its feet. Jason stood frozen, glass trembling in his hand, his world crumbling around him. Emily touched his arm, whispering something, but he shook her off angrily. His mask had slipped, and everyone saw the cracks. By the end of the night, Jason avoided me entirely, his once loud laughter silenced. He left early, dragging Emily with him, his shoulders hunched in defeat. As I stood on the steps outside the ballroom, the night air cool against my face, I felt no gloating triumph. What I felt was freedom. Jason had tried to erase me, but instead, he had erased himself. The morning after the charity dinner, I woke to a string of phone calls. Old colleagues, business partners, even acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years. All of them had the same message. "We heard what happened last night. You stood tall, Richard." By noon, I heard the whispers spreading through town. Jason had embarrassed himself. His drunken outburst, his desperate attempt to belittle me, had backfired in the worst way. His boss, who had been at the dinner, was livid. By Monday morning, Jason's firm was already talking about restructuring. In finance, image was everything, and Jason's had cracked beyond repair. Meanwhile, my phone kept buzzing with opportunities. Mark's projects were expanding, and he wanted me more involved. Other companies reached out, asking if I could consult or even mentor younger contractors. For years, I'd been invisible. Now I was back in demand. But the victory that mattered most wasn't about business. It was about Emily. That Sunday, she came to visit me. Her eyes were red, her smile shaky. "Dad," she said softly, I didn't know. Jason never told me what he said to you. I thought his jokes were harmless. But last night, I saw who he really is." I put a hand on hers. "Sweetheart, I didn't want to ruin your happiness. But sometimes, people show their true colors when they think no one's watching. Jason showed his in front of everyone." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "He made me feel like I had to choose between him and you. But I see it now. You never asked me to choose." He did. I pulled her into a hug, holding her the way I used to when she was a little girl. For the first time in months, I felt peace settle in my chest. My daughter knew the truth. Jason's mask had shattered, not because I tore it off, but because he couldn't hold up anymore. In the weeks that followed, Jason's downfall accelerated. His boss cut him out of high-profile projects. Clients began avoiding him, wary of being tied to his arrogance. The very people he once flaunted in front of me now whispered behind his back. Emily tried to make it work, but it didn't last. Jason's bitterness grew as his career crumbled, and soon their arguments became too much. 6 months later, Emily showed up at my door with a suitcase and tears in her eyes. "I'm leaving him, Dad," she said. I should have listened sooner. I hugged her again, grateful and heartbroken all at once. No father wants to see his daughter suffer, but I was proud of her strength. She chose dignity over pretense, truth over lies. As for me, life took on a rhythm I hadn't expected at my age. I wasn't chasing revenge anymore. It already played out. What filled me instead was purpose. Consulting projects kept me busy, but they also gave me something greater: respect. Not the shallow kind Jason craved, but the kind that came from years of proving yourself, from standing tall when others try to knock you down. One evening, months later, I drove past Jason's old house. The lights were off, the lawn overgrown. A "for sale" sign leaned crookedly in the yard. It was a stark reminder of how quickly false success can crumble. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel anger. I felt closure. Jason had tried to define me with one cruel phrase: unemployed loser. But in the end, he had defined himself. And I had reclaimed who I was: a man who built, who endured, who refused to bow. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the photo of my late wife smiling down from the wall. I raised a glass to her, whispering, "We did it." He thought I was finished. but you knew better. The storm of humiliation was over. The man Jason tried to bury had not only survived, he had risen stronger, sharper, untouchable. It had been nearly a year since that night at the charity dinner, the night Jason's mask finally slipped and his empire of arrogance began to collapse. Life had changed in ways I never expected. My days were no longer filled with silence and regret. Instead, I found myself back in the rhythm of work, advising on projects, mentoring young builders, and occasionally walking job sites to watch new foundations take shape. Every time I watched concrete being poured or steel rising against the skyline, I felt something inside me stir. A reminder that my hands, my knowledge, and my years still mattered. But the greatest change wasn't in business. It was at home. Emily had divorced Jason 6 months after his outburst. It wasn't easy for her. Betrayal never is. But she carried herself with the same quiet strength her mother once had. When she told me she was leaving him, she said, "Dad, I finally realized you're the one who's always been steady. Jason was just noise." She moved into a small apartment across town, and we started seeing each other more often. Dinners, long walks, even lazy Sundays where she'd help me sort through old boxes of family photos. Slowly, the wedge Jason had tried to drive between us dissolved. We weren't just father and daughter again. We were partners in rebuilding what he had tried to break. Jason's life, meanwhile, became a cautionary tale. His job evaporated after too many burned deals. His colleagues distanced themselves. Clients refused to take his calls. I heard he'd tried starting his own firm, but without credibility. It collapsed before it began. Eventually, he left town. No goodbye, no fight. Just a man retreating from the wreckage of the world he'd built on lies. And I chose not to chase revenge any further. It had already done its work. What Jason lost was his own doing. I didn't need to twist the knife. My focus was forward. One bright Saturday morning, Emily and I drove out to the edge of town. A new community was being built there, rows of homes sprouting up where there had once been empty fields. Mark's company had a contract, and he'd asked me to consult. As we walked the site, Emily slipped her hand into mine. "Dad," she said softly, "when Jason called you an unemployed loser that day at the wedding, I didn't say anything. I should have defended you." I squeezed her hand gently. "Sweetheart, you don't need to carry that weight. Jason's words didn't define me. They defined him. And if anything, they gave me the push I needed to remember who I was." She smiled through misty eyes. "You're more than who you were, Dad. You're who you are now. Stronger." That night, I sat at my desk, looking through the notebook where I had once scrawled my vow for revenge. The pages were filled with plans, notes. Moment of fury turned into strategy. For a long time, I thought revenge was a goal. But as I closed the book, I realized it had been something else all along: rebirth. Jason's insult had been a spark, but what it lit was a fire I didn't know I still had. A fire that burned away grief, humiliation, and doubt, leaving behind something stronger than pride: purpose. I poured a glass of whiskey and walked out onto my porch. The night air was cool, the stars sharp against the dark sky. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of what I'd lost. I felt the strength of what I still had: my daughter's trust, my community's respect, and the knowledge that I had faced betrayal and come out whole. And in that quiet moment, I realized something simple but powerful. Storms will always come, whether tornadoes that rip apart houses, or men like Jason who try to tear down dignity. But storms don't last forever. Foundations do,